Dr. Nathalie Edmond is on the show with me today. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and yoga teacher. She owns a group practice in New Jersey and has an anti-racism consultation business. Nathalie, thanks for being on the show. How's it going?
Good. Thanks so much for inviting me, John. I'm really excited to talk to you about more of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I know you're in New Jersey. What's the town exactly?
My practice is in Ewing, New Jersey, so it's between
Okay.
Princeton and Trenton. Yeah.
Okay. So I have family in Pennington.
Oh, yeah. That's where I
And
live.
okay. Oh, okay. Wow. That's really small world. Most
It
people
really
have
is.
not heard of Pennington unless you
Yeah.
live there or even,
Yeah.
and then my uncle works in Princeton. So, over the years I would always go and visit him at work and then go walk around the campus and just be in awe of how beautiful it is. This is a
Right.
really, really beautiful place and,
It really is.
obviously a special school, but anyway, so I'm familiar with that part of your world.
That's great. Yeah, I just stopped working at Princeton University. I was working there part-time the last 5 years. I just stopped at the beginning of June just to dive deeper into my anti-racism work.
Amazing. Were you doing some of the anti-racism work in the counseling center there as well, or what kind of work were you doing on the campus besides counseling?
I was doing a lot, I was coordinating their mind-body team. So a lot of like, how do we bring mindfulness and more embodied work onto the campus, as well as I was doing a lot of like training of future psychologists there as well. And anti-racism stuff came up a lot just in my individual counseling with a lot of BIPOC students. So a lot of
Mhm.
students who were lower socioeconomic status, who weren't used to kind of the Princeton culture,
Mhm.
or who are just underrepresented, just the struggles that they have in navigating those predominantly white spaces.
So, and how long were you doing that work?
I was there for 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you're at Princeton for 5 years and growing your practice at the same time
Right.
and growing it into a group practice at the same time and doing the anti-racism consulting and that work uh, almost as part of your practice, but really is kind of like a separate, kind of like under your personal brand, we might say.
Yeah, so I was a hospital administrator for many years, director of a women's trauma program, and then 5 years ago left that and decided I wanted to branch out into private practice. So I went to work at Princeton part-time. And so I did solo practice for 4 years. And then last summer or last spring, I decided I wanted to really grow because there was such a need.
Mm-hmm.
So when I built my private practice, I really was intentional about where I decided to set up shop. And so I really wanted to serve a more ethnically diverse clientele. I had been part of a group practice that served in Pennington, actually, that served predominantly white clients. And I was really hungry as a Black psychologist to really serve more people who look like me. And so I picked a town over Ewing that is much more ethnically diverse and
Mm-hmm.
has a broader range of clientele. And I was also knew that I had to probably decide to take insurance if I wanted to make it more accessible. So I joined one insurance panel and I was amazed that I've worked part-time in a group practice in Pennington for 9 years, and I
Mm-hmm.
saw more Black clients in 2 months in my private practice than in 9 years. And so
Wow.
that was like startling to me, that it wasn't that they didn't want therapy, it was that where I was located and the fact that that practice didn't take insurance, I wasn't going to see those clients.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. So, location and accessibility, or access to services, are huge. Did you just have a sense that opening the practice in the other location would result in a more diverse caseload? Did you actually look at numbers like census numbers in terms of the area?
I wouldn't even say that I was that precise. I looked
Okay.
more about what was the makeup of the town. And so it just knew that from a numbers perspective, the demographics are almost like the exact opposite. And so I just figured it would draw more people. And Ewing is interesting because it's very close to the state capital of New Jersey, which is Trenton. And so there are a lot of state agencies around there. And so I picked an insurance company that was like the most popular insurance company and so just that, a lot of state employees, people working at local universities. So it just drew a lot of people. And then on top of that, I picked a building that had a lot of foot traffic in it. So people just would come to see the dentist, they would come to see the primary care doctor, and they would see my name and build connections that way.
And tell folks the name of your practice as well, because that communicates something.
Yeah, so last summer when I expanded to a group practice, I named it Mindful and Multicultural Counseling. Before that, it had just been my own name. And so I really wanted to really lift up mindfulness was something important value, but also multicultural. And so then all my marketing, my website, everything was specifically saying I'm centering people of color, I'm centering the LGBTQ population, I'm centering people who tend to be marginalized. And it was just very intentional. And I remember having initial fears like, are you going to be so specific and obvious? But I said, I really want to, that's who I want to center. And I had been turning away clients for so long that I really wanted to then hire clinicians who could fit that value. So it's been an interesting journey in terms of one, I'm very explicit of what I'm trying to center, that it's going to be primarily insurance-based. And so it kind of weeds out the people who aren't interested in that. And also I talk about that I want to offer mentoring and supervision and that there's going to be some required reading. So I have all my clinicians, regardless of their ethnicity or racial identity, read Waking Up White by Debbie Irving and Mindful of Race by Ruth King. And we talk about it in staff meetings and group supervision, and even the way that I run meetings or run my practice, I try to have some anti-racist components to it as well.
Was all of this, did you sit down and kind of create this vision before you started doing it? Or was it that you just kind of started doing it, or even like the books, for instance, did you just kind of start doing it as part of your overall focus? Or did you sit down and say, this is the kind of practice I want there to be this kind of focus. There's going to be these kind of real focus on training around diversity and multiculturalism. What was that process like?
I think when I did my solo practice, I wasn't that intentional. I was just like, I'm just going to put my name up and whoever's going to come is going to come. But what I found pretty quickly was that I was attracting a certain kind of client. And so, and a client that I didn't even necessarily know existed. So I was attracting a lot of professional clients who either identified as LGBT or trans. I was attracting a lot of those who identified both as, let's say, a person of color as well as another marginalized group. And then I was, attracting people who had less resources as well. And so I was like, wow, there's just really a need and not enough people either who are in the town, because I mean, if you go a town or two over, it's oversaturated with clinicians. And so some of it is about just people want to go to maybe therapy in the town they work or live in and not have to travel 20 or 30 minutes. So I think part of it is that. But also I was doing trauma-informed therapy. I was offering mindfulness and yoga. And I was really, inviting people to talk about issues of race and issues of marginalization. And I think it helped that I looked, as a person of color. And so that made it less stigmatizing to a lot of people. But I also find that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like that they don't mind working with someone who is white as long as they get it, right? As long as, because I hear a lot of clients talk about there's a shorthand when you work with someone who identifies like you, like there's something you don't even have to communicate. But what I heard a lot of clients say is that even with white clinicians is that sometimes it feels like it wasn't comfortable to talk about issues of race. And so I wanted to be very clear. So so when I expanded to my group practice, I did write like a vision statement, a mission state, like what are my values? And I actually gave it to prospective clinicians. Like, this is what I'm looking for. And this way people could buy into it.
So making it super explicit was a big part of it. Location, accessibility, right, in terms of private pay versus insurance. And so but going back to the identity piece, or knowing that, let's say, if my therapist looks like me, therefore they must understand to some degree my position, my challenges that are related to that identity. How do you balance that with, I guess, the bigger picture of empathy, right? Or if a client is going through, I don't know, let's say they've lost a parent and we haven't lost a parent, right? And then the counselor's role is in part to practice empathy, to imagine what it must be like to lose a parent, right? To practice accurate empathy, et cetera. Because there's that dilemma as well, as of your therapist can't possibly have gone through everything you've gone through in order to kind of
Right.
get you and be effective with you. And yet, if there is an identity piece, right? Or let's say if it's a process of being a person of color, on one hand, I can't get that from an experiential point of view. I can only get that through hearing your experience, resonating with your experience, right? I don't know what my
Right.
question was, but something in
Yeah.
there.
Well, it's interesting when I hear you say that. I think about two things. One is that just because I look like you doesn't mean I get it, and it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
even mean that I'm anti-racist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I've heard plenty of let's say Black identifying clients who go see a Black identifying clinician who they don't feel is supportive or empathize or is validating, and
Yeah.
so I think it's like the identity may be like the assumed likeness or affinity is like an initial barrier that's down, but then you still need to have skill and empathy and a certain lens. But what's interesting, I think, in my practice is that even though maybe, like, so I have a team of 8, and maybe half of us identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, and the other half are white identifying. And but those clinicians are, I would say, have a really high retention rate, even if, like, even with
Mm-hmm.
their clients that are Black or Latinx. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something about the ways in which that they're thinking about things and the ways in which they're able to hold the space that those clients feel affirmed. And I've worked with those clinicians around like discomfort that we often have talking about race
Yeah.
or talking about identity or sexuality, like the
Yeah.
taboo topics that we don't necessarily learn growing up how to talk about in comfortable
Yeah.
ways.
So, uh, something that I was kind of taught in graduate school was when I am working with a client um, uh, with a different racial or ethnic background, is to basically take that step to invite them into a conversation about it, right? And at least kind of be the one to open that door for the client and say, listen, I want to just like call attention to the fact that, this is a difference that we share. What's that like for you? Do you feel like that's a good kind of practice in general?
I think it's a great entry point, and I think it's not enough, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think that many clinicians do that, and then it definitely signals that I get that we've had different experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and so it says kind of it's on the table. And yet, if I think about what's been going on in the last maybe 6 months or so in the
Mm-hmm.
United States around maybe like starting with the murder of George Floyd and then like all the events related to Black Lives Matter movement that's gone on since, is that a sense of perhaps the collective grief and rage that's been accumulating over, generations. And so
Mm-hmm.
how does one talk about that and understand all the different ways that might weave in? That, I think about like some of the value as a therapist is how do we bring to light things that the client may not have been thinking about or may not have made that connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think part of anti-racism as like a clinical lens is recognizing all the ways in which white supremacy and like our conditioning
Mm-hmm.
impacts our, productivity, our striving, our difficulty with rest, our body image. So I think it goes deeper because it's like weaved into so much stuff that I think even impacts white identifying people in terms of, so many of our clients who have difficulty with rest, and it's always what's the next achievement and what will,
Mm-hmm.
the more money, and like I'm never enough. And I think that kind of mentality also is
Yeah.
part of kind of anti-racism work.
So you did some training with both our mastermind groups around this stuff, and kind of becoming an anti-racist organization, even if you're a solo practice of one.
Right.
certainly applicable. But part of what you talked about in that kind of chart of white supremacy and the more covert ways was perfectionism. That was
Hmm.
something that I was really surprised to see on there.
Yeah.
Can you say more about why that's a factor?
Yeah. So what I love about like at least the anti-racism training that I've been associated with is that
Hmm.
there's overt racism and then there's covert racism, as you mentioned, right? And I think covert happens every day, right? When we think
Hmm.
about microaggressions, right, they're like the everyday little slights that happen to individuals based on various different identities.
Yeah.
And so perfectionism is like a symptom of white supremacy or a value of white supremacy, as is like black and white thinking, as in productivity and a sense of urgency and objectivity and control. Like all of
Hmm.
those are part of white supremacy culture. And so I think what happens though is that um, for some people that comes really easily to them, and for other people it creates stress and
Hmm.
depression and anxiety and shame. And so like my version of anti-racism is that we're all impacted by it, right? And so to the extent that we can help people start to change the culture, and that then I think we can promote healing in all individuals regardless of their identity.
Hmm. Well, one thing I've learned and thought a lot about recently is just leaving things to assumption is incredibly dangerous and problematic, right? Even therapists who just assume that clients assume that we are safe
Hmm.
for any identifier, right?
Right.
Whether it's their faith, their sexuality, again, racial or ethnic background or identities. I think especially right now in the state of our country, people are wondering, where do you stand? People are wondering, where do you stand with these issues, right? And so if it's not explicit, then people will make assumptions. And in reality, clients will make assumptions before they even uh, are there sitting on the couch with you and giving you the opportunity to, right, take a stance on it.
Right. And I think about at least when I was growing up, that color blindness was seen as like the preferred value, right? And that
Yeah, I
that
think
made
that's
you not
super
that made you not
problematic.
racist,
Yeah.
right? And yet, like on some level, I get it, right? That we're saying like we're all part of the human race, we're all the same,
Yeah.
we all bleed the same, right? And it doesn't take into the account that the world reacts differently to me as a black
Yeah.
cis woman that they do to you as a white cis man, right? And
Yeah.
so and we're gendered all the time, like in seconds we're gendered, right? And
Yeah.
so I think like how do we hold both of those truths, that like we're
Yeah.
all the same and yet we're not all the same because the world treats us differently. And so I
Yeah.
think about so I think what's problematic, I think, in terms of a lot of racial discussions is that white people tend to see themselves as individuals, right? And so, um, and yet a lot of people of color are seen as part of a group. And so I think what happens,
Hmm.
right, if you're not being explicit about where you stand, is that the assumption is going to be based on factors that
Yeah.
you don't even think about. So I'm going to assume that someone is going to be against me than for me in general,
Yeah.
right? That's our
Yeah.
negativity bias. It's safer to assume the worst than to assume like I can take a risk with this person.
Yeah.
And if I'm used to moving around spaces in a way um, that protects, let's say, white people or protects me, right? So maybe I don't show my full self in predominantly white spaces,
Yeah.
and why would I take that off in the therapy room,
Yeah.
right? It would be really hard to do that.
Of course. Some experience I had recently in kind of confronting a very white organization around this stuff. Their response was basically, "Well, um, we're not like uninviting Black people. We're not telling them they can't come,
Mhm.
right?"
Right,
Which I think is an extremely problematic stance, right?
right.
It would be um, yeah, it just seems obvious that that's problematic, right? And that's also a very passive stance of like, yeah, we're not, it's kind of like we're not doing any harm. We're not saying that people of color can't, join our organization, right? Or can't become our clients or whatever, but everything we're doing is like extremely white, extremely homogenous. And that in itself is a problem.
Right. And it doesn't take into account that even if that one individual, right, is very open to a variety of people joining, right, that 400 years has said that there have been a lot of white only spaces, that even when the doors were open, there were a lot of messaging that said you weren't welcome.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering, so another thing to talk about is obviously, and I think this is a tremendous limitation in my own training, was very indoctrinated in theory, approaches to psychotherapy that are just rooted in old white men seeing white clients of privilege in a
Mm-hmm.
comfy office in Palo Alto, California. Um, and, uh, um, and that's where a lot of these case studies are coming from. Things like Irvin Yalom, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral therapy, right, with Aaron Beck. I mean, again, these are like, big names and people that a lot of us kind of look up to and follow. And then you look deeper into the way that they conceptualize clients, right? Or even the way that my program was highly focused on the individual, but never really the individual in context of their life, their environment, safety, access to resources, food, the effects of discrimination on mental health, the effects of, again, community safety, things like that. So what are your thoughts on that? And maybe also more practically, how do you work around this sort of stuff with your clinicians as they're conceptualizing clients in your private practice?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's so hard. I think about how so much of that is white centered. And so if the standard is whiteness, right, then it becomes, how do we start to say, like, what's pathology? Like, what's problematic?
Yeah.
And I think also as a therapist, we have so much power in terms of, are we trying to teach clients how to deal with an oppressive system, or are we trying to dismantle the oppressive system? And it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like, which one do we have control over, and which one
Mm-hmm.
takes much more time? But I think if we're all trying to help clients assimilate to a white-centered system, then I think we miss out on all the authenticity and richness and culture of all these other populations. And
Yeah.
so this idea of community, of this idea of culture, this idea of emotions
Yeah.
and different ways of expressing it or dressing. It's so interesting that I think of even things around time, right? That like time is also a very Eurocentric kind of concept in
Mm-hmm.
terms of being on time, right? And
Yeah.
there's even jokes that happen around like colored people time, right? And so, but it makes it appear as though one is the standard and the other one is problematic.
Yeah.
And so, how do we, like, everywhere, everything that we think about is all based on that. So
Yeah.
it becomes really hard to start to challenge it. So I think having supervision or consultation or groups that really help you start to unpack all the ways we've been conditioned. Because I think about that white centered, which isn't just whiteness, right? It's also, I think about like neurodiversity, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if my brain works in that neurotypical way, right, then life is easier for me. But if my
Yeah.
brain is maybe more ADD, or like I'm more of a sensory person than like a verbal or written word person, the world is harder for me and the world isn't built for me. And so I think about all the ways in which the world isn't built for certain people and how that causes pain and stress and shame and suicidality.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, the more that we can start to broaden, right, so that we're targeting the most vulnerable populations, right, who are the most marginalized, the more we can enrich our society,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I always think about like whose stories aren't being told, whose stories aren't being centered,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes a lot more effort to do that,
Mm-hmm.
because mainstream, you open a book, it's going to teach you a certain thing, and it's so much harder to learn about all these other ways of being and thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned to our group, even the phrasing that people use around the murder of George Floyd uh, matters and is significant, and is, if you're looking for these subtleties, is an indicator of potentially something more problematic, right? Um,
Right.
what's your do you invite these conversations in your practice, right? Or talking about what's happening in our country? Also, how do you handle things such as justice, equality, police brutality, things like that, in the line to where it gets political, I guess, or if you have people in the practice that maybe have different political views?
When you say in the practice, you mean like clients?
With your clinicians, sorry, or
Clinicians?
with your clients. That's certainly
Right. Yeah.
an even more
It can
interesting
come up.
question.
Yeah, it could come up either way.
Happens.
It's interesting in terms of clinicians. So far, it hasn't really come up. I think probably because I've been so transparent about kind of where I stand in terms of anti-racism work. And so
Mm-hmm.
even the series and workshops I offer it for free for my
Mm-hmm.
clinicians because I want them to deepen their understanding in these areas. So I haven't really experienced it as something,
Mm-hmm.
but also I invite in like free dialogue about this stuff, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
don't have to agree with me. I
Yeah.
want them to start to critically think for themselves and explore their own privilege and their own ways of doing things so that they can, I mean, my definition of like true diversity is that people's full selves are able to enter into the room. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't have to be like that I like everything about you, but the fact that you
Yeah.
feel safe enough to be able to bring your full self into the space.
What if a client says something racist in a session?
I think it depends what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I rarely experience overt racism in terms of clients. It's going to be much more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I once had a client who, um, it was a white cis female client and older, and I remember like there seemed something off in our relationship. Like we were working together, but it felt hard. And at some point, you know, we mutually agreed that we weren't going to continue to work together because
Mm-hmm.
I felt like she needed much more validation than I could provide, and that opened the door for her to talk about that she experiences Black women as intimidating, which made all the sense in the world because often the feedback I got from her was a sense of maybe I was a little too direct or I was a little too intense, and I thought something is this like coded language
Yeah.
for something, but I don't exactly know what it is. And so, and she would make like little comments like about the location of my office, like coming into the building, she would have a reaction to it, but that when she entered my space, it was so calm. But like to me, that was coded language for she was used to being in Princeton or somewhere
Yeah.
else,
Very
right?
white
And so,
places.
yeah, and so, but she was never going to say that, right? Most people are not going to say a lot of those things, but they're going to say it in much more subtle ways. And so she was a person who like, it just felt like I wasn't going to be able to be the one to help her.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt like if it would have been another client, I would have had a more open conversation with them about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think
Right.
sometimes it's like the clinician determining when is it
Yeah.
not a good stylistic
Yeah.
experience and when is it
Sure.
that we could do some really meaningful work around here, because I'm sure she has other colleagues who are Black identifying who maybe she has
Yeah. The
tensions with.
same. Yeah. Yeah. It's either potentially not a good fit, or potentially the perfect fit or the perfect opportunity for some sort of corrective emotional experience, right?
Right, right.
With that being said, how do you tease apart, let's say, racism from projection or countertransference, right? In that case, right? It's like you basically kind of represent something to her that's been difficult historically.
Mm-hmm.
We would call that transference, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
in that model of kind of
Right.
psychoanalysis, psychodynamics, we call that transference. But how do you tease apart those two, right? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting for me because I guess for me, like I think of we're all we all have racist ideas
Mm-hmm.
on some level because that's the foundation of the United States, and so my spectrum of racism is much broader. So I know that when people think of racism, they think of this binary system of you're racist or you're not racist. And if you're
Yeah.
racist, you're bad. So I don't think of it in that way. So because I know I have racist ideas that I've had to really work hard to undo, that have been internalized. So I guess I think as a person of color, I see almost everything through the lens of race, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is just, I can't not do that
Mm-hmm.
in order to survive. And so for me, transference, countertransference, there's always an element of race in there. There's always an element of gender, of
Mm-hmm.
class, ableism. All of that is always woven in. So it's more about asking the question is, how is race showing up in the room,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what's named, what's not named? How is it impacting, the life experiences I've had and the training I've had and
Yeah.
where the client is coming from? To me, it's just another question that
Yeah.
I'm just asking myself.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here. One thing I've thought about and I think about quite a bit is I live in San Francisco again, and it's by the numbers of a very diverse place here, especially the East Bay as well, Oakland, where I have a number of clients. It has certainly come up before around what does it mean for someone like me to go to therapy at all, or to talk about my problems, right? Or again, to be a person of color going to a white dude, to work on my problems or talk about my anxiety. I've also had, a number of clients who, because of religious reasons, they're very secretive about coming to see me. They're very ashamed of coming to see me. So I'm wondering, how you think about those things in terms of like what a client's culture says, or what they've grown up kind of knowing about what it means to seek help. What does it say about me to seek help, or especially to seek help again from a white dude like me?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much room for validation, right? To talk about the larger systems and structures that kind of make it that, therapy is seen as someone um, who tends to go as someone who's white, right? And of a particular class and education. And yet, and yet this person must be suffering, right? Um, and what an opportunity and courageous for them to decide that they want to reduce their pain and suffering by doing this. And that I think as a clinician, that they shouldn't trust me until it's been earned, right? Until I've shown that I am someone trustworthy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that I guess I feel like part of therapy is helping people trust their gut and
Mm-hmm.
helping people be able to find the truth within them, right? That I'm only guiding, facilitating the process for them. And so I have a certain knowledge base, but also there are many times where I need to seek consultation because I don't have enough knowledge of the particular area that they're talking about. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to be clear about that and honest with them about that and
Yeah.
humble about that.
Yeah. I'm wondering in terms of working with clients. Well, here's an example. So years ago, when I just started this practice, was a solo practitioner. Someone called me one day and they said, "Yeah, you're John Clerk, right? You're the guy that specializes in polyamory and open relationships." And I wasn't that guy. I had worked with one client that was in an open
Huh.
relationship, and the way I approached it, she was kind of testing me out early on and saying, "Hey, we've been working together for a while, but hey, by the way, I'm thinking about, having multiple partners. What do you think about that?" And of course, I'm like, "Well, what do you think about that? What appeals to you about that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What might that be like for you?" She went on to kind of uh, kind of immerse herself in that world. And through that experience taught me a lot about the terminology, what to say, the issues that come up. She gave me book recommendations, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was kind of teaching me how to work with people in open relationships. And
Right.
then someone calls and says, you're that guy, right? And I'm like, well, I didn't mean to be that guy, but I
Right.
feel ready enough to work with you around this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, so to what degree do you, like, I clearly benefited from the client's experiences, right? And from her coming in and me just being open to go, I don't know anything about this. Teach me about it. I want to learn
Right.
about you and your world and what interests you. And then I was doing some work on the side. But again, also don't want to put it on her to, hey, teach me how to work with this group that is not the majority group.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such a tricky dance. It's definitely a dance, I think, that,
Mm-hmm.
that there's some clients who that's probably part of their healing process is to
Yeah.
share in that way. And for others, it would appear burdensome. Right. And so I think it sounds like you had a good sense, right, that wasn't burdensome to that client. And so it sounds like you both really benefited from it. And
Yeah.
so I think about, but it also sounds like you were willing to do a lot of the work to like get up to speed and to really identify it, and you were able to hold the space, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
so much of this is about being able to hold the space, right? To kind of like, I look at myself, like I know where my edges are, where my bias is.
Yeah.
And then I have to like know like how to compensate for that, or to be clear, like I'm going to do more harm than good. And so I think we just always have to do that, because I think sometimes that works and then sometimes that doesn't.
Yeah.
And then I think also when we bring in things like race, I think race is such a emotionally hot topic, right? That's so complicated that
Yeah.
I think if that's a blind spot for someone, then we could be doing microaggressions without recognizing it. And
Mm-hmm.
then that could be problematic, especially if, like to your point earlier, right, that might discourage someone from coming back to therapy, because they might generalize that, all therapists are kind of like this. And
Yeah.
so it's not for people like me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a lot that's uncomfortable about doing this work, right? And part of what's
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable is that it's never done.
Yeah.
I think some therapists, I even know therapists in the city who like did all the CBT trainings at the Beck Institute and like got, all these certifications and got really comfy. It's like, that's just me. I finished my training, right? Almost like
Mm-hmm.
I'm competent, or,
Right.
it's that doing it for 7 years or however many hours it takes, according to research, to become an expert. But what's really uncomfortable about this is, right, the work is never done. Our
Right.
internal work is never done, right?
Right.
I'm constantly finding new blind spots, right? And I could always be doing more. Someone recently once told me on an episode on the show that basically, especially for me as a white man with basically all the privileges, it's appropriate that I should never feel like I can rest or that I can have done enough, because I'll never do enough.
Right. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. There's one microaggression I want to ask you about, and
Sure.
at the risk of sounding naive, I'll just go for it. The microaggression is asking people, where are you from, right? Or when people have a slight accent or look like they're not from here, whatever it might be, where are you from, right? That's by the books a microaggression, right?
Right. Yeah, I think
Go
so,
for it.
because it becomes, why are you asking the question? Like, is that a standard question you ask everybody? Maybe, right? But also I think that often when I do my anti-racism training, I said that people need to look at what their social location is, and in
Right.
comparison to the person they're speaking with,
Right.
right? So if I was a white person speaking to a person of color, I would want to keep that in mind whenever we're having a dialogue. And I would want to know, this is where like having some knowledge is helpful, is that question is often associated with a sense of you don't belong here,
Yeah.
right? Or like you're not clearly white. And
Yeah.
so even if I mean no harm, like I'm just genuinely curious, as a
Yeah.
white person, I should know the history of that question,
Yeah.
and hence perhaps not ask it, or to be more explicit about what I'm actually asking.
Or why you're asking.
Yeah. And I think that's what's
Yeah.
challenging, is to think of yourself as part of a group
Yeah.
versus then you as just an individual who's curious.
Yeah. I struggle with this one in part because I really love learning about other cultures. I love language. I love learning languages. So when I hear an accent, I selfishly want to know if my intuition was right as to where they're from or where they were born or what their native language is, and also if I can. So I speak Spanish and French. If I can switch to Spanish or French and speak their language and kind of immerse in their culture in that moment, that's something I want to do. again, I see how that can be problematic, especially in context. At the same time, when I was living in France, people would hear my American accent in French, and they would ask me every day, "Where are you from?" Right? Or
Sure.
they would just say, "You're American," right? Because they could
Mhm.
understand my accent. And there's people all over Europe from different countries that are very, central, very close to one another. So it seemed like a question that was asked all the time,
Mhm.
because there's a lot of different, there's a lot of people speaking English, but with different accents that might be harder to recognize. And
Right.
so it felt more okay there. It didn't feel like
Right.
a faux pas,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that context matters, right? So that probably in France, right, that there's a different history there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you being like American sounding
Mm-hmm.
is it's different, right, than here. And I would say even here, um, like I loved when you were talking about that you love languages, right? So it would almost be like, why not lead with that? Like I love languages, um,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't quite place that accent, and
Yeah.
part of me is just curious because I would love to know if I could talk to you in this other language, and
Mm-hmm.
and so like that sounds so different than where are you
Where are you
from,
from? Yeah.
right? Because you've put yourself out there. There's a vulnerability there that you've
Mm-hmm.
put out there, which
Mm-hmm.
sounds so different.
The other possibility is that they say, "I'm from here. I'm from the same place as you."
Right.
you
Yeah. And
know?
then,
Yeah.
right. And I think what's problematic is that people usually then ask a follow-up question when they say they're from here versus people just saying, oh, okay. Yeah. Like I just couldn't quite place that accent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So, well, we've got just a couple minutes left here, and I'm thinking for therapists listening, they're probably wondering, number one, how do I start this work in my practice or continue this work in my practice? So maybe just a couple things you feel like they could do after today, in their practice. And then, of course, number two, I'd love for you to share a bit more about how you actually work with therapists and practice owners, solo and group practice owners, I imagine, to do this work in their businesses.
Sure. Well, I think first thing is I always think about like a lot of transformation comes from doing our own internal work. So whether for you that's listening to podcasts, reading books, watching documentaries, being involved in book clubs and group supervision, that any place that's going to allow you to like to explore your blind spots, to go to that edge, right? That's a safe place for you to do that. So I know I've acquired a lot of resources over the years. So I've created an anti-racism resource page on my website, both my group practice website and my personal website. So on drnatedmond.com, there's a whole anti-racism resource page, which has videos I've done and has a bunch of other places people can go. I just wanted to create a hub. And it's interesting. It was my way of kind of grieving for uh, George Floyd, was to
Mm-hmm.
create these resources for other people out there. The other thing I think is we're living in a time where there's so much information out
Mm-hmm.
there. So there's so many different ways that I think people can plug in to their level of time that they have available. I offer a lot of different things myself, but I know so many colleagues who are doing things, but I offer anti-racism series. So it's like 3 parts, small group, like 15 to 20 people of, across the country, different fields. And we just get together to talk about things. So I'll do like a little didactic about kind of, some common terms that are being talked about these days, like what is a microaggression, what's white supremacy, what's institutional racism, what is the Black Lives Matter movement, what's white supremacy culture. So I do a lot of that stuff. And so we do a lot of discussion so people can really start to dive deeper into the ways in which they've been conditioned. And I do it from this mindful, compassionate place. Like there's no need for shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what we don't know. And once we do, what are we going to do about it? And people who want to become allies or accomplices, however you like to use the
Mm-hmm.
word, like there's a path for that. There's so many different ways to plug in. And then
Mm-hmm.
I do also, I
the
think
the
of racial,
approach, just real quick, the approach
yeah,
matters so much because
yeah,
people don't change behaviors from shame. Like there's a
yeah,
reason why you don't see ads anymore for like or a lot of ads like billboards saying quit smoking or smoking kills you. People don't,
right,
that doesn't motivate them in the right way. If they already
right,
decided, hey, I think I want to look at my smoking habit, and you come into that conversation with a gentle approach, with mindfulness or
Right.
curiosity, right? It just makes a lot of sense versus
Right.
shoving it
Yeah.
down their throat.
Yeah. And I want to model for them that if you're going to go talk to family members or colleagues, or you're going to try to make some changes in whatever business industry you're in, that we need to find compassion. We need to do our own work and see, where's our anger, where's our rage, where's our sadness. And we need to own that for ourselves if we're going to heal, because this polarizing thing that's happening, it's not really going to solve issues in the long run. And so we need to find ways to bridge and come together. And so I think that's a skill that a lot of us don't develop.
Yeah.
How to deal with conflict in healthy ways.
Yeah.
For sure. Then the other work that I do is, I do supervision around cases for people who want to take more of a multicultural, anti-racist lens to a lot of information. And then also I do a lot of trainings for group practices who want to deepen this on their teams and really create a culture or paradigm shift. Because I really think that that's what that is, that if we only like plug in, it becomes more performative and it's not really deep and it won't really last. And the people that you might be trying to include, maybe hiring more BIPOC clinicians or broadening the client population, that they're not going to see it as genuine because it doesn't have the roots there.
Yeah. The key is to get started, right, with where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And to move past, for some therapists and for white people like me, our guilt, move past our white guilt of, hey, well, I feel like I'm late to the game, or I feel like I'm a therapist, so I should already know this stuff, right? I think there's a lot of that. But even equipping people with the language to start talking about race is a huge step in creating that environment for them to say what comes to mind, I think is huge. And then they get more comfortable and can start adding on to that work from there. But just getting started, I saw a lot of therapists over the past few months, really, who have kind of said, I don't know what to say, or I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing about the Black Lives Matter movement, about George Floyd, so I'm not going to say anything. And I think that's the wrong approach, right?
Yeah, and I think in many ways that's equally problematic, right?
Yeah.
Because I've seen a decent amount of posters that says silence is violence, right? And thinking about historically how often it was people saying nothing that allowed the bigger crimes to occur.
Yeah.
And so if we can build skills so people feel like they're equipped to say something and to sit in that discomfort, then I think change really does. There's a lot of momentum that's built from the ground up.
Yeah. Yeah, people assume if I'm saying nothing, at least I'm not perpetuating a certain problem. But again, especially I think for people with privilege, people, myself included, it's we are doubly obligated to say something, or to try, and to make it a sustaining effort, not a let me post to Instagram once to my friends and family,
Right.
about Black Lives Matter, and that's it. I think
Right.
that's the other risk too that kind of bothers me in this, is people that want to just basically kind of virtue signaling, right? Of like, hey, by the way, I'm anti-racist, but then I'm going to be back to my usual business for the rest of the year.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
And I
this has
think
been
having
amazing.
that support system, I just think having that support system makes it easy to keep going, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing it in isolation, it's like anything, right? If you're trying to lose weight, but you're doing it by yourself with no support system, then it's going to peter out usually.
We forget our basic skills as therapists around this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. There's something paralyzing about this, for sure.
Yeah. We forget what we know about behavior change and how people transform and where beliefs come from, right? Or creating conditions for people to change.
Right. And that it takes time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, this has been great. So for people that want to get in touch with you about doing some training in their practice, drnatedmond.com, right?
Yes.
We'll
Yep,
put a link to
exactly.
that in the description, of course, as well as a link to your private practice if people want to check that out. And thanks again for doing this. It means a lot to me, and it was a lot of fun. We'd love to have you back sometime.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care.